3 years ago, my friend Gabe and I cut up a maple tree. We got partway through it before my chainsaw decided it was just not going to start. So I'd packed up all of my milling gear and drove off to Vancouver, Washington, where the tree was. Now, I did a whole video on milling this tree, which I'll put a link to down below. Along with the slab and a half or so that I got from this tree, I took some of the pieces from the branches. So you can see the pieces of branches in the background here, which could be cut in half and made into blanks for turning on the lathe. So I brought a couple of those home and I cut those in half, and I could use each of those halves to make bowls on the lathe. So I can cut it most of the way through and then flip the piece around and then cut the sort of the bottom of the piece as it's the top by pulling the saw up and through the piece. Now I can find a approximate center on this. Now, the way I've been doing this, I have a sort of a jig on the bandsaw with a screw coming up through the bed of the jig, and I can put this hole at the center over that screw, and then I can rotate the bowl blank around that center. And early on when I was doing this, like this piece, I would use a thinner blade and rotate the piece around the center and get a nice round cylinder. But I found the thinner bandsaw blades would dull pretty quickly. So more recently I've been doing this with a wider blade and not trying to cut such a perfect cylinder. And I'll just rotate the piece around the center, but I just won't cut the curve. I'll just cut a bunch of shorter straight segments and get close to a cylinder. Now I can turn this into a bowl blank. I can start with the outside and get that round and sort of bowl shaped. Then cut a mortise for the chuck in the bottom of the piece. And I'm not quite sure why Calvin's in the shop at this point, although he's about 2 feet taller now. So I can turn the blank around and put it in the chuck on the lathe. And I drilled out the center. Hollowing out the bowl, cutting the center is sort of the hardest part because it doesn't move very fast. In fact, the very center doesn't move at all. So it's a little quicker to drill the center out, and you can also use that as a depth gauge to know how deep to go. So you can just hollow it out at this point. So now I've got a blank that I can coat and let dry for a few years. This is some wax emulsion paint that I get at a local place. I've heard that latex paint works for this as well. I've never tried that, but that's what I hear. So when you're drawing a blank like this, what you want to do is to have it dry evenly. It can dry quickly, it just needs to dry evenly. If different parts of the piece dry at different speeds, that's when you'll get stress in the wood and you'll get cracking. Painting it like this is just slowing down and sort of evening up the drying process. I can let this sit for a few years now. Really, it's about a year is what it needs. And I've learned I really need to label these when I do them. It feels like I'll remember what this was, but in a year or two, I'll have no idea where this is from or when I turned it. So it's been 3. I labeled this 2016-0409. So April 9th of 2016. So I guess that's almost 3 years it's been drying. It hasn't cracked, although there's some little cracks around the center on the two sides. But what it does have is it has this nice knot. And what I was thinking is I could use the extra bit that I had left over from the Christmas ornament from 2 years ago, the peppermint ornament, and that this would make a nice decorative piece to cover. So I could cut out a circle around the knot and then put this into the bowl. It'd make kind of a neat pattern. And then as I was looking at this, I found a couple other bowls where I could do this same thing, where the bowl didn't really crack, but it had some knots and some things that I wanted to take out. So I thought that'd be a fun way to do it. So I've actually made a few more of these, which I'll show for a little bit now. It's really similar to the way I did it for the Christmas ornament. So I can make the little circular inserts now. So I found some different scrap pieces of wood from around the shop. There's some walnut from the school art project, I think, and some leftover maple. And I cut those into strips. And then I cut the angle into these pieces to make the segments for the ring. Now I picked 36 segments because if you divide 360 by 36, you get a nice 10-degree angle. And that makes it easy to set up on the saw. Then I can cut those strips into segments. I think I'm doing 4 at a time here, which makes it go a little faster. Now I like to test to see whether my angle was close, and it actually worked out perfectly, which is amazing because it usually doesn't work like that. So when I rip these on the table saw, I end up with a section that gives me a right triangle. So one of the angles is 90 degrees, and then the other angle is less than 90 degrees, I guess. So it's not a balanced wedge, which means when I put them together into a ring and then put force on the outside, it pushes the wedges to not aim directly for the center, and they start to wrap around the center, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that pattern, but I thought it would be interesting to try and balance out that angle on the outside and maybe pair 2 of the wedges together so that instead of the way I'd been doing it, where I have all of the right angles on the same side, I would pair them together, and the right angles would be on opposite sides. You get a ring where all of the slices are pointing towards the center. With this many segments, when it's been glued up, getting it even is sort of an exercise in sort of mushing the pieces around until they're about where they should be. The center isn't perfectly round. You can get the outside pretty close, but the inside's kind of a blobby shape. But that's okay because that will get cleaned up once this is dry. Now I need to be able to hold these down to the CNC table. So what I want to do is glue them to a scrap piece of wood, and the scrap piece of wood I can hold down to the CNC table. Now I can drill out the centers, and I'm going to make a plug to fit into this hole. So now this is going to get mounted down to the CNC table, and I want to get pretty close to the center of these, so I kind of used a piece of tape to help with that. And I ran a test cut around the top to see if I was centered, and it was pretty close. So what I want to do now is clean up the outside edge of these pieces, and I want to cut these with a taper so that when they fit into the bowl, they'll be in a tapered hole. So I have a 3-degree tapered bit, and I can clean up the outside with that. So I set up a routine to kind of cut circles around the pieces and get closer and closer each time. It would cut air in the beginning, and then it would start to shave off just a little bit of the outside. And after a few passes, it would give me the 3-degree taper on each of these. Now, the first one I did, I did it as a down cut, and I got a bunch of fuzz, and I wondered, I wonder if this 3-degree tapered bit is an upcutting bit, because I bet it is. So I reversed the direction, and that gave me a much better finish. So that's how it's done. So once I had this working, it went pretty quickly. Now I want to make the plugs that go on the inside circle. So I found a piece of walnut that I had cut up a few years ago, probably out of a free log I'd gotten from somewhere. But it had a lot of defects in this piece, so it's a good piece to make small parts out of. So I clamped it to my vertical table, and I can cut the cylinders that I need out of the end of this piece. My segmented pieces are going to be end grain on the end, so I cut these from the end of this piece so that my center cylinders will also be end grain. So I flattened the end so it would be parallel to the CNC router, although this isn't really all that critical. Then I could cut the centers out of. Now what I'm not showing here is some testing to make sure I had the right diameters here to fit into the holes that I had drilled with the drill bits. Because I found each bit in the router is a little bit different as far as how much variation there is off of what it's supposed to be. Like if I've got a 1/2-inch drill bit and it's a 1/2-inch hole, drawing a 1/2-inch circle in the computer and cutting that out isn't necessarily going to be exactly a 1/2 inch. It's going to be slightly different. And as far as getting the fit for the plugs to be right, I find I need to either subtract or add a few thousandths of an inch to that. So now my segmented insert pieces are ready, and I want to get the bowl set up to cut the holes into the bowl. So the first thing I want to do is clean up the mortise in the bottom of the bowl where the chuck will hold the bowl on the lathe. It used to be round, and now that the bowl is dried and changed shape a little bit, the mortise at the bottom isn't round anymore. So I need to clean that up. Trying to get towards the center, but I'll have to cut off or sand off this little bump in the middle. Now I can pull this chuck off and put the other chuck on, and I can turn the bowl around and get the bowl round. Now this isn't critical at this point. I could put this on the CNC and cut the holes, but I wanted to make the sides a little bit thinner so I wouldn't be cutting quite as much on the CNC. And it would help having a round bowl to work with at this point, so I'd know there wasn't a bulge or an off shape to this as far as where I was gluing the inserts. Like having this round sort of gives me a datum to work from. But mostly it's just to get the sides thinner so that I don't have to cut as deep, which starts to make a real difference because it's a curved shape. As you get further and further away from perfectly perpendicular, that depth starts to get deeper and deeper. I can clean up the inside now. It's round now, and the bottom works with the chuck. And I can put it on my adjustable table. I was trying to figure out where this should go and how big the knot was and where the best place was to clamp this on the table. So I used my new little clamping setup. So having this table adjustable allows me to get the angle that the bowl is sitting at close to where the part that I want to cut out is perpendicular to the bit of the router. So I can cut out this one knot in this bowl. And I did a first test cut to see that I was in the right place, and then I started it up again. Now, something that was really interesting with this that I didn't see until I saw the video footage was that the wood around the original branch of the knot got broken out, and I actually had a perfectly round hole with the original branch in the center of it. And it actually would have been interesting at this point to have just filled this with resin and had the original branch in the side of the bowl framed in a circle. But I didn't see this at this point. I was just cutting and working and worried about the shape of my hole. So I cut the hole with a straight bit and made a cylinder. And at that point I decided I should cut my segmented pieces free so I would have them to test the hole that I was cutting in the side of the bowl. So I cut those pieces free. Then I put everything on the bandsaw and cut the actual inserts free from the scrap piece of wood. And cutting the scrap piece off at this point is really just making it easier to turn, as these inserts are going to go in with the skinny end into the hole first. Now I can cut the taper into the hole that I've cut in the bowl. And that should be pretty close. And then I want to cut a finishing pass, and that should make it perfect. And I can take that off. I wanted to sand off a little bit of the lip on the inside that I didn't get to with the CNC machine, but I didn't realize that I really cannot damage the two tapered surfaces that I've made. Because if I do, I get a gap in the seam. And I was sanding this, being careful, and I hit the side of the tapered surface. And I realized that I had screwed this up. Now, one thing I did to be careful is the hole that I had cut in the bowl at this point was for one of the smaller inserts. And my thinking was, if at any point along the way I screwed something up, I would at least have a little bit of wiggle room to use one of the bigger inserts if I had to. And when I hit the side of the hole with the spindle sander, this was what saved me. I could use one of the bigger inserts, which I think was actually better for this knot. But it meant that I had to put the bowl back on the CNC machine, refine the center and refine the angles and get everything set up close enough so that I would cut the new taper within the difference of the smaller and the bigger inserts. And what the tapered hole and plug mean is that I can clamp this into place and give it just a little bit of pressure, which will give me a tighter seam than just two cylinders going together. So this bowl had one knot in the side. Then it had the center of the tree running from one side to the other side of the rim, which is sort of like the main knot of the trunk. So I wanted to take out sort of a little bit more than a half circle on each side. So I don't want the center necessarily where the center of the tree is. I would put it out here somewhere. I want it to cover up and take out the cracks. So I'm trying to find the center of where the cracks are. So I started to cut one of these sides, and I stopped it to make sure my piece was going to fit. And it was. I just wanted to be sure. Then I reran the hole again. Then I can cut the taper, and I just cut this as a circle and just let it cut air where it's not contacting the bowl. Now there's two of these, so I just need to rotate the blank around and cut the other side. And then cut the taper and take it off. You can see the two holes now and how the two plugs are going to fit. Now, I thought I would clamp these in place, and I tried some different things, but because it wasn't a full circle, it wasn't really staying in place very well. So I just put some glue in the seam and held them in place for a minute or so, and that seemed to work. Now I can go back on the lathe. Now it goes back into the chuck easily. So at this point, it's turning off the segmented pieces as they stick up from the surface. So it's just a matter of trying not to chip those too badly. Now, in looking at this, I know everyone's going to want me to have left the circles that are sticking up above the rim, but because of the way the grain works, they were basically blowing out where there wasn't any support from the bowl. So there was really no way to turn those the way that they were sticking out from the bowl. So I just cut them off and made them flush with the rim. And in doing that, I discovered I really like the way the geometry of the segmented pieces intersects with the geometry of the bowl. You get kind of a funky pattern. Now, I got the outside pretty close to the way I wanted it. And I could work on the inside. I was thinking about it, and usually you want to make things pretty thin and light and delicate. But I didn't want to push this segmented pattern too much. And it's really more about the patterning in the bowl and the segmented pattern. So I didn't make the bowl real thin, but I took a lot of the thickness of the sides out. And I worked on the rim and the area near the rim first and got that pretty much finished, and then worked in towards the bottom of the bowl. Because if you work on the bottom part of the wall of the bowl, you can't really go back because there isn't the support and you get a lot of vibration. So it's best really to work on the rim and then work your way in towards the center. And I'm trying to figure out the thicknesses and getting it somewhat even. And then I'm scraping and trying to get a good surface on the inside. And I got the surface on the inside and the outside really good with the scraper, but it still took a lot of sanding. I probably spent as much time sanding this as I did turning it. I kept finding scratches that were bigger than whatever sanding paper I was at. So I would have to step back to a rougher paper and resand, and then start going to finer and finer, and then I'd find more scratches and I'd have to go back. And it took most of an afternoon to get it sanded and smooth. In the end, it turned out really nice. Now I need to fix just a little bit on the bottom. It's really close, but I just wanted to get the bottom shaped just right. So I could cut off and shape that and then scrape it and get it smooth. Then go through the sanding process in the bottom. And this went quicker because it was a much smaller surface area. Then I can sand the inside of the mortise and take off that little bump in the center. And this actually went really quickly. Now, when I put finish on, if I'm going to use an oil-based finish, I like to wipe the piece down with mineral spirits first, and that gets all the dust off. I just put butcher block oil on. I kind of just wanted a flat, kind of matte finish on this. The end grain kept soaking up the oil, so I kept having to add more and more. And once the finish dries, it won't be this shiny. What I really like about the patterning on this bowl is the play between the natural grain of the bowl and the more geometric patterning of the segmented pieces. Because the segmented pieces went in where the knots were, the wood grain kind of talks to the geometric shape. It's not just a random insertion into the pattern of the grain. And I like that. Thanks for watching.